Hello, today I'm going to talk about my top 10 underrated horror films for Halloween. So I'm a huge horror film fan. I have several top 10 videos on my channel that have to do with different kinds of horror. Folk horror, cosmic horror, etc. But I thought this Halloween I would do something a little different and talk about movies that I think are underappreciated or underrated and perhaps even undervalued. So I'm going to start with just showing you a quick list of films that I've done in my prior top 10 lists that I actually think are quite underrated. I have also done separate videos on the film Mandy from 2018, which I think qualifies as a horror film, and also Exuma, which is a Korean ghost story from 2019. So before I get into the list, I'm also going to mention a few films that I wanted to put on here, but I decided I was only going to pick 10, and they were kind of edged out. The first is Black Sabbath, Mario Bava from 1963. Phantom of the Paradise from 1974, that's Brian De Palma. It's a musical, but it's also kind of a horror story. Very strange film. The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane from 1976. A very, very odd film with Jodie Foster and Martin Sheen, but quite interesting. The Howling from 1981. I do think it's an excellent film, and I do think at times it's underrated and probably overshadowed by An American Werewolf in London. Morgiana from 1972. This is a Czech film, very, very strange film. It's not exactly a horror movie, but it has horror elements. It's more of a psychological thriller, but it's very odd. Lair of the White Worm, which is from 1988. That's an awesome vampire film, I guess you'd call it. Near Dark from 1987. Very underrated vampire film by Catherine Bigelow. Audition from 1999. This actually was very close to making the list. I watched it recently, but it's just a little bit too much torture porn for me. I have to say it really, the last few scenes just kind of, it's just, yeah, I don't know. If you're into that kind of thing, like movies like Saw and stuff like that, you will love this movie. It wasn't really my thing, but I can't say that it's not a good film, and I think it is a bit underrated. 30 Days of Night from 2007, and the last one is Neon Demon, which I think many people don't really consider it a horror film, but I definitely think it is, and it's from 2016. And it gets kind of a bad rap, but I actually think it was interesting and shot very well. And here's my list. At number 10, we have Night of the Demon from 1957. Directed by Jacques Tourneur, stars Dana Andrews, Peggy Cummins, and Neil McGuinness. And the threat is demon/occult. A supernatural horror classic about an American psychologist investigating a satanic cult in England. The film explores the chilling presence of a summoned demon and the psychological horror of disbelief. Known for its eerie atmosphere and tension, it's a landmark in occult horror. There is a US version of this film called Curse of the Demon, but that's been cut from the British version. I watched the British one. I'll say this, if you've seen I Walked with a Zombie or Cat People, this is very similar, and those films are directed by this man. And I think they are similar in the way that they're shot and the kind of vibe of them. John Carpenter, Joe Dante, Guillermo del Toro, and Terry Gilliam all cite this as an influence. And director Martin Scorsese placed Night of the Demon on his list of the 11 scariest horror films, which I find pretty impressive. I'm not sure if it is that scary, but it had its moments. I think its strengths are the atmosphere and how it kind of builds up. There's the entrance of the demon. This isn't really a spoiler. It's a very strange visual effect, and I think it's super effective. However, once you see the demon, the design is kind of an odd choice. It's almost looks a bit childlike, and I can usually forgive that for films of this era because these special effects were not, at the level that they are now. I don't know. The the choice of making it like this is just interesting to me because on one hand it's sort of childlike looking, and what I mean is not looks like a child, I mean looks like a child made it almost. And part of that actually makes it more unsettling, I guess. The main antagonist is very Crowley-like, Aleister Crowley. In fact, I wonder if when they were making this film, if they, leaned into that a little bit. All in all, I think it's pretty good. I mean, I don't know if it's as good as some of the other directors said it is, but I definitely think it's underappreciated. And, you don't hear about it very often. At number 9, we have Eyes on Fire, also known as Crying Blue Sky, and I review the director's cut from 1983. The director is Avery Crounce, and it stars Dennis Lipscomb, Guy Boyd, and Rebecca Stanley. The threat is witchcraft, supernatural entities. Set in the American frontier, a group of settlers encounters a haunted forest filled with supernatural forces. Combining folk horror with surreal visuals, Eyes of Fire is an underrated gem with eerie and mystical undertones. So this is a low-budget independent film, and you can kind of tell at times the acting is kind of hit and miss. There are moments where I think the people really deliver, but then there are other moments where I'm like, okay, maybe not. The actors make it happen, I'll say that, but I think it's more how they're written. There's one woman in the story in particular who plays this kind of savant, and she nails the role. I think she's probably one of the best ones in the film. And there's also a guy that kind of plays this haughty British dandy who is a bit of a, I don't want to say a cult leader because he's not really nefarious in that way. He's actually more cowardly. He's more of a guru or, a false prophet or something. He does a good job, I think. Some of the secondary people, not so much. It's slow getting started. It took about 40 minutes for it to really go anywhere. However, once it does, it's like it just goes crazy, crazy into the folk horror. But one thing I think is great about this film is the way it's shot, and I think they got a lot of production value out of their money. There are moments, especially when they're filming in the morning or nearer to nighttime, where there's this kind of misty morning vibe, which creates this kind of dread because they're in this deep forest. There's the fear of nature. There's this great scene where they use this orange filter in one of the morning shots that just, I don't know. It's very cinematic, and I think it transcends the budget quite a lot. They're raising this poorly constructed wooden cross, similar to Iwo Jima, and it's sort of lit by the orange sky and stuff, and it's just a really great shot. And it's kind of saying a lot because, there's this kind of like hope going on, but obviously it's a horror movie, so the hope kind of goes downhill from there. But there's something kind of pathetic about it, about the raising of the cross. Like the audience knows what's coming, but the people don't. And they're kind of foolishly sticking to their faith, like in many occult sort of folk horror films. There are some generally creepy scenes with these spirits, and I would say they're kind of Lynchian. If you've seen Twin Peaks: The Return, it's very reminiscent of that, as well as the garbage thing in Mulholland Drive. I was genuinely creeped out several times throughout the film. But what is, I think, most unique about it is it's mainly shot in daytime. There are some night scenes, but a lot of it is during the day, which most horror movies are not shot that way. And I will say that it reminded me a bit of Picnic at Hanging Rock or The Virgin Suicides. There's this, the way the cinematography is, there's a lot of like sunlight, and in Picnic at Hanging Rock, the angles are all kind of strange, which creates this kind of disorienting feeling. This movie is a lot like that. I think for an independent film, it's quite good. I don't know, maybe it could have been cut a little differently and been improved even more, but I think it's pretty good. and definitely underappreciated. At number 8, we have Let's Scare Jessica to Death from 1971. And the director is John Hancock, and it stars Zora Lampert, Barton Heyman, and Kevin O'Connor. The threat is psychological horror, ghosts, vampires. A subtle and atmospheric film that follows a mentally fragile woman who moves to the countryside to recover, only to be haunted by strange occurrences. The ambiguity between reality and hallucination creates a creepy, unsettling experience. This is another low-budget film, although I will say it's slightly more successful than Eyes of Fire. One of the things that really makes this film work is the soundtrack, which is mostly synth. And if you know anything about 70s horror films, they are defined by synth soundtracks. And I just think it really works, always. As soon as I hear that kind of music, I'm immediately drawn into Dario Argento kind of vibes, Day of the Dead, I don't know, Dawn of the Dead, like all these films that kind of use that soundtrack. It screams kind of exploitation film to a degree, but it's used very well here. Creates a very unsettling atmosphere. David Lynch and John Carpenter both love the atmosphere in this film. They've mentioned it before in the past. It's a great setup, and there's this twist early on that I did not see coming, and I thought it was cleverly done. It makes you go, oh, okay, now I see what's happening. And the actresses who play the two female leads, I think, are perfect. The actress that plays Jessica, I think she really nails this kind of fraught, hanging on by the end of her nails energy of someone who had maybe had a nervous breakdown or something in the past. So she really carries that well, I think, through the film. And the other female lead, I'm not going to say what her role is in it because it'll kind of spoil it, but she does a good job too of shifting into these kind of different roles, let's say. There are some similarities to Messiah of Evil, the film I mentioned earlier. There are these kind of strange townsfolk, and I think there's nothing scarier than going into a small town and having people staring at you in this eerie vibe. It's quite effective. The film is overall very dreamlike, and it is quite eerie. The real strength of this film is not knowing what's real. There are things where you're like, wait a minute, is that in her head, or is that not happening, or is it happening? And I think that really elevates this movie. I will say that I think David Lynch got a lot from this film. In a lot of his movies, there's always this struggle with identity and paranoia and stuff, and I think that is on full display here. At number 7, we have The Eyes of Laura Mars from 1978. Directed by Irvin Kershner, starring Faye Dunaway, Tommy Lee Jones, and Brad Dourif. The threat is a serial killer. It's a slasher film. A stylish psychological thriller about a famous fashion photographer who develops a psychic connection with a serial killer. The film mixes horror with a detective mystery, presenting eerie murder sequences through the protagonist's visions. So John Carpenter wrote the script for this along with David Z. Goodman, and I really wish he had directed this film. I think it was a situation that is not unlike Quentin Tarantino. So when he got famous, Tarantino, suddenly Hollywood wanted all these scripts from him because he had a bunch of scripts he had written, and he was suddenly the big boy on campus. The films True Romance and Natural Born Killers kind of came out of that, right? I think this is a similar situation where at this time Carpenter was just banging it, and I think he probably just sold this script. Now, I really wish he would have directed it, and I'll get to that in a minute why. The person that did direct it, Irvin Kershner, is the man who directed Empire Strikes Back, Star Wars, which is a great, great film. So I'm not saying he's a slouch. However, I think the movie would have been a hell of a lot better if Carpenter had directed it. And I think it would have been a much scarier. I just don't think Kershner is maybe cut out to do horror as well as Carpenter is. So with that said, the film is this kind of 70s lens of fashion world. It's very 70s. Even, I mean, came out in 1980, but it feels very 70s. Helmut Newton did all the photography, so it definitely has this high fashion vibe going on. It's a little silly at times. It's like almost too, oh, this is the fashion shoot. However, the film definitely goes there, and it has some awesome twists in it. There's a young Tommy Lee Jones. In fact, he's got a full head of hair, and it's very strange to see him in that state. He actually reminded me a bit of Josh Hartnett a little bit. I love Faye Dunaway, and she always delivers, and she's quite good in this. I think she sells the role of being the photographer, Laura Mars. There's this commentary on voyeurism, not just her and her camera, but the killer and the victims, and it's kind of double played. There's almost a third level because she's kind of having these psychic visions, which isn't a spoiler, it's in the description. Yeah, I mean, there's so many levels of voyeurism. Part of it felt a little bit Hitchcockian, I think. There are generous amounts of nudity in this film. I was actually kind of taken aback by how much mainly women are naked in here. I don't think it could be released these days. I think it would get a lot of flack, but if you like seeing a lot of nude models running around, you're definitely going to like this. It is a very strong whodunit. There are many possible perpetrators, but all in all, I definitely think I would love if we lived in an alternate universe and Carpenter had directed this. I just think it would have been stellar. At number 6, we have a tie, and it's a tie between two werewolf films. The first is Curse of the Werewolf from 1961. This is directed by Terence Fisher, starring Oliver Reed and Clifford Evans and Yvonne Romaine, and the threat is Werewolf. A Hammer horror film about a man cursed to transform into a werewolf under the full moon. The film delves into themes of repression and uncontrollable rage, elevated by Oliver Reed's tragic performance as the doomed werewolf. So Terence Fisher is known for his Hammer films. He has made several of the most classic Hammer movies, including Horror of Dracula, Curse of Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Devil's Ride Out, and many others. But I think this is the most underrated one. I really, really love this film, and I've always loved it ever since I was a kid. Part of the reason I think it's so great is Oliver Reed's performance. You know, Oliver Reed was an alcoholic, and I think he channels a lot of that angst of addiction into this role as the werewolf. The production value is top-notch, like most Hammer films. There's this creepy sequence I remember from when I was a kid that always was very unsettling to me. It's set in the past before Oliver Reed is born, and it's kind of how he comes about. It is through these kind of dubious means, and there's this old man in the scene that just creeps me out to no end. He is nightmare fuel, and what happens to his mother is just horrific. And I'm not going to spoil any of it, but to this day, it just unsettles me. The rest of the film, though, you know, Oliver Reed is the main focus, and yeah, I mean, the werewolf part, I don't want to say it's an afterthought, but it's more about the man than the werewolf. And I find that quite interesting, especially because not only is he the werewolf, but like you can kind of feel that he's the werewolf as the man, which I don't think a lot of the werewolf films get right often. It's sort of more two-sided. I think this film gets a lot less love than many of the other Hammer films. I would say The Gorgon is also a great Hammer film if you haven't seen it, as well as the Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. That film is hilarious. I love that movie. And the second werewolf film at number 6 is Dog Soldiers from 2002. Directed by Neil Marshall, starring Sean Pertwee and Kevin McKidd and Emma Cleesby, and the threat is werewolves. A tense and action-packed horror film that follows a group of British soldiers in the Scottish wilderness who encounter a deadly pack of werewolves. Known for its practical effects and blending horror with military action, Dog Soldiers is a modern cult favorite. The beauty of this is that it blends several genres. It's got dark humor, it's got horror, and it's got action. And yeah, I mean, it's a fun setup, soldiers versus werewolves. I mean, what child hasn't thought of that? how great that would be. But I think what elevates this is the direction and the good characters. It's quite action-packed. It has impressive practical effects by Paul Hyatt. Because it was filmed in the Scottish Highlands, it has this kind of high production value despite being a relatively low-budget film. I think Kevin McKidd is a very underrated actor. If you've seen Trainspotting or Rome, you'll know what I mean, but he's been in many other things, but specifically those two roles I think he's quite good in, as well as this film. Yeah, I mean, this doesn't reinvent the wheel. It's basically kind of Night of the Living Dead, but with werewolves. I also felt that there's this kind of Evil Dead feeling to it a little bit too. You know, being kind of stuck in the house and stuff. Yeah, it's quite good, and I definitely think it's underrated. There was talk of a sequel, but that never happened. Maybe it will happen someday. I don't know. At number 5, we have Oculus from 2013, directed by Mike Flanagan, starring Karen Gillan, Brenton Thwaites, and Katie Sackhoff. And the threat is Haunted Object, psychological horror. A horror film about a brother and sister trying to uncover the malevolent force behind an ancient mirror that has destroyed their family. The film plays with time and memory, creating a disorienting psychological horror experience. Flanagan is known for Haunting of Hill House, Midnight Mass, Fall of the House of Usher, Gerald's Game, Doctor Sleep. So he is an accomplished filmmaker, and I'm quite excited because he has acquired the rights to the Dark Tower series. And if he makes it even half as good as some of his other TV series, I think it's going to be amazing, and I can't wait for that. This film is based off of one of his short films called Oculus Chapter 3, The Man with the Plan, which was quite successful, so they convinced him to rewrite it and make it into a feature. Like many of his creations, there's this play between past and present. He does this in a lot of his films and TV shows. But one thing I think he excels at is his character work. Not just the actors that he gets to play the people, but the way that they're written and how much the script dives into their past and makes you really understand them as people. If he does that in The Dark Tower, I'm going to be ecstatic because those characters deserve something like that. So if he pulls it off, I will be very happy. As a general rule, I think haunted objects scare the piss out of me. I'll just be honest. So maybe I like this film more than other people might. What was scarier than the object was the deterioration of their mental states and not kind of knowing what was real and what wasn't. Flanagan is a master at what I would call horror eyes. He does it in many of his films and TV shows. One scene in particular that reminds me of this film is in the film Gerald's Game. The woman is on a bed and she's trapped there and she's trying to get away, but she can't. She starts kind of seeing things in the dark and you don't know if it's real or not. And there's one moment where these kind of lit up eyes happen and it's terrifying. And that's something he does here that I think is very effective. And I just think he's great at that, and it works well here. He's good at the setup, he's good at the build-up, and how to create tension. My two gripes with this film is the first, the ending. I'm a little unsure about it. I get it in terms of a horror ending, but there's something unsatisfying about it for me. And the other thing that I think drags it down a little bit is the plot hole. I'm not going to give away, why they're doing all this or what they're trying to do, but I think an easier way would just be to sink this thing at the bottom of the ocean, fly it over Antarctica and drop it or something. I don't know. Just something it's sort of a convoluted, you need it in order for the story to happen, but if you think about it too deeply, you're like, well, why did they do that? Anyway, other than that, I think this is a top-notch film, especially considering people know him more for his other work. I think this is an early version of what he eventually became, and I think it really works, mostly. At number 4, we have The Exorcist III, which is called Legion in the director's cut. It's from 1999. It's directed by William Peter Blatty from his script, and it stars George C. Scott and Brad Dourif. The threat is demon possession and serial killer. This is a more faithful adaptation of William Peter Blatty's novel. It removes the theatrical cut's exorcism scene, focusing instead on a psychological horror and philosophical themes like guilt, faith, and the nature of evil. Brad Dourif's chilling portrayal of the Gemini killer is expanded, making the film more unsettling and introspective. This cut is a slower, cerebral exploration of the character's inner conflicts, creating a more haunting and disturbing experience. This film is terrifying. I mean, obviously the original Exorcist is also terrifying, but I think this gives it a run for its money in some ways. It's quite different than the original, so don't go into it thinking that you're going to get a repeat, because it's not really the same. I saw the original cut of this at the movie theater I worked at late at night. It was terrifying. My cousin and I saw it, if I recall correctly, and we were like, that was scary. And that was not this director's cut, that was the original cut, which I don't think is quite as scary as this one, but it was still super scary. I think the director's cut is superior. The problem with it is, in order for it to be assembled, some of the footage is a bit raw. So, it jumps from cinematic level to a little, almost looks like it's done with a handheld or something. But it still works because Brad Dourif's performance is top-notch and the writing is top-notch. This is a taut mystery with this building mounting dread. It's kind of a procedural cop film in a way, but then obviously there's this heavy religious overtone going on. Brad Dourif nails this role. This might be his best performance ever. It's definitely up there. Part of it is because of the script. He has a lot of juicy things to say and very devilish things to say. But if you know him, you know he's really good at playing crazy, and this is like upper tier crazy and quite terrifying. There is a lot of startling imagery. Most of it is kind of religious focused, which I think makes it a bit scarier. When you have a normal serial killer movie, yes, a killer is scary. But once you add this level of demonic possession and, the occult and these higher angelic and demonic battle, it just becomes a whole nother thing. There is one scene in this film where a nurse is checking out rooms at this sanitarium. The buildup is impeccable and the payoff is amazing. It is just like, oh my God, what just happened? It is so good. It is so good. Most of the killings aren't shown on screen, which is, I think, more effective because the violence is implied and it makes it scarier because you kind of imagine what happened. You're often seeing the aftermath of what occurred, and it makes you kind of have to fill in the blanks. And the ending is very satisfying. It's just, okay, yep, bam, and it works. You can watch this free on Tubi if you want to check it out. It is very good. At number 3, we have Let the Right One In from 2008, directed by Thomas Alfredson, and it stars Kari Heidebrandt and Lena Leanderson, and the threat is vampire. A haunting and poignant film about a bullied boy who befriends a mysterious young girl who turns out to be a vampire. It's a unique blend of horror and tender coming-of-age story with beautifully eerie cinematography and a thoughtful exploration of loneliness and friendship. This film, when it came out, it got a lot of hype. I remember the hype. I didn't actually see it until long after that. It's based off of a novel by this guy. I'm not going to butcher his name. I've read that the novel is quite different, whereas the movie centers on the two leads. The novel has a lot more tangential characters and stuff. So I am a little curious about the novel. I will say, of all the films in this list, this is the least horror in my opinion. There are horrific elements in it, but I really think it's a character drama about two children with some unsettling things in it. One thing I think it does well is sets a tone, a vibe, an atmosphere, and it's sort of this cold, snowy isolation and kind of loneliness. You definitely feel it from the boy character at the beginning. The child actors in this are phenomenal. I was very impressed. Hildebrandt and Leanderson just really sell the premise. I mean, it's possible it could be done with other actors, and I know they made a remake. I'll get to that in a second. However, I just really think they embody these characters. In fact, I cannot really imagine anybody else. This is a unique vampire story in the fact that it's not really about being a vampire. I mean, it is, but it isn't. It's more about being outcasts, I think. It's quite touching. I felt myself kind of emotionally taken in by it. The remake is called Let Me In. Matt Reeves made it. I haven't seen it. If you think it's good, you can comment below. I might check it out. I don't know. I'm usually a little reluctant to see remakes of really good movies, but every once in a while, somebody pulls it off, but more times than not, that's not the case. Yeah, I mean, it's not very scary, at least not to me it wasn't, but I think it's quite effective, and I do think it's underrated. I'm a little two-sided about the ending. The ending in a few of these films, yeah, I'm not sure if they work. In this one, I find it odd, his choices. I'm not going to say what they are because I don't want to spoil it, but I don't think he's thought it through, I guess is what I'm saying. At number 2, we have Dressed to Kill from 1980, directed by Brian De Palma, starring Michael Caine, Angie Dickinson, and Nancy Allen. The threat is serial killer slasher, a stylish and suspenseful psychological thriller about a series of murders linked to a psychiatrist and his patients. Known for its Hitchcockian influences and striking visuals, Dressed to Kill is a classic in psychological horror thrillers. I mentioned in some of my other videos how much I love Brian De Palma. This is maybe one of his most underrated films, one of them. He is amazing at subversions and double subversions. If you've seen Carrie, you obviously know he's a good filmmaker as far as horror is concerned. But he has several other movies that a lot of people don't know about. A really good one is called Sisters, very creepy. The Fury, Body Double is amazing. All of those films have similar qualities that relate to this one, but I think this is definitely his most underrated. The less I say about this film, the better, so I'm not actually gonna get too much into it. I just recommend that you go in blind, don't read much about it if you haven't seen it. There are some very tense encounters, a lot of suspense, a lot of playing with identity. If you know De Palma, you know that he is a master of camera innovation and visual style. The performances are great. I think Nancy Allen doesn't get enough credit. She's in some amazing films like RoboCop and Blowout, and she just doesn't get enough credit, in my opinion. This is quite violent, so be prepared for that. The score of Pino Donaggio was nominated for an Oscar and also won a Golden Globe, and it is excellent score. It definitely works with the movie. Yeah, I mean, the last thing I'll say about it is just, if you know De Palma, you know that whenever you watch one of his films, you're in for a roller coaster ride and you have no idea where it's going, and that is exactly what this film does. At number 1, we have The Innocents from 1961. Directed by Jack Clayton, starring Deborah Kerr and Peter Wingard and Megs Jenkins. The threat is ghosts, psychological horror. A masterclass in gothic horror, The Innocents follows a governess who becomes convinced that the children in her care are possessed by malevolent spirits. It's based on Henry James' The Turn of the Screw. It's a slow burn, atmospheric film that leaves its viewers questioning the line between supernatural and psychological horror. So this starts with a black screen, and it's an awesome way to set the tone because you hear this child singing this kind of Weeping Willow song, and This song becomes very important throughout the film, but I was just immediately drawn into it by the way that they decided to start the movie. It just works really well. Like I said, this is based off The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, but Truman Capote wrote the screenplay. This is a gorgeous film. I can't rave enough about how beautiful this film is. It's got this luscious black and white where it almost looks silver at times. It just rings so true. It is a masterclass in cinematography. There's excellent shot composition and use of light and shadow. I couldn't really believe how well it was executed. Like every frame is like a painting, or you know those really amazing photographs you see which are just like perfectly designed. That's how every frame of this film is. The cinematographer, Freddie Francis, totally outdid himself in this movie. If you've ever seen The Elephant Man, he is responsible for the way The Elephant Man looks. It's no slight to David Lynch. However, once you see this film, you're going to go, oh my God, exactly. Because they look very similar. And if you know The Elephant Man, you know how beautiful that film is. It's just gorgeous. Aside from all of that, this film is really good at building dread. There are these kind of subtle whispers and voices happening, and you're not sure if they're ghosts or in her head or something else. There's just a lot of ambiguity going on. The child performances are excellent. The two children are quite different in their delivery, but they're very effective. Deborah Kerr nails her performance, I think. Her paranoia and her ambiguity of what's going on and her kind of the elevation of her franticness just really work for this. I'm not sure why this is so unknown. I just don't understand. I mean, it should be up there with Psycho, Night of the Living Dead, Rosemary's Baby, like legendary films, and you don't hear anything about it, and I just don't get it. I just don't understand. If you've seen Mike Flanagan's, I believe it's Bly Manor, I think that is based off of this story as well, although I think it's done way better here. Yeah, it's just, it's great, and that completes my list. If you have anything to say about any of these films, or if you think that there's something I should have put on here, obviously there are many, many, many underrated horror films. So you can like and subscribe, all that stuff, and Halloween is coming up, and I hope you have a good Halloween, and maybe watch a few of these and get scared. That's all I got. Have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.